Age of Exploration was a time of rapid development in several different fields of technology. Most notable among these was shipbuilding. Before the Age of Exploration, the typical European ship was known as a cog. It was a simple, flat-hulled, single square-sailed ship used primarily for short-distance travel and hauling small amounts of goods. It was sturdy and fairly weatherproof, but slow and unmaneuverable, and also couldn't really hold any meaningful amount of cargo. As the demand for faster and larger ships grew, these models quickly became outdated. New models, such as the caravel and galleon, were developed in Mediterranean countries with access to Arab influence. Arab ships were lighter and faster, but also generally more delicate and couldn't handle the violent seas of the North Atlantic, and thus were unfit for long-distance sailing. They were much more efficient, but they needed to be blended in order to create the perfect ship. They generally had several banks of oars and lateen sails, which allowed for speed, but not as much cargo room as their European counterparts. The blending of European and Arab models resulted in the creation of the caravel and galleon ships. These ships were faster than the European counterparts, while more rugged than the Arab ships. They were perfect for long-distance travel and could carry large amounts of cargo. They blended the square sails of the European with the triangular lateen sails of the Arab, the elongated shape and pointed hull of the Arab with the deep hull of the European. They were very sturdy and perfect for warfare and travel. The most important advance in shipbuilding, however, was the stern post rudder. Earlier rudders, as seen in the Arab and European ships, were a single oar suspended from the back. They were highly dangerous and ineffective. Most oarsmen died very quickly as they were flung off the side of the ship. The new rudder let the oarsmen work in the safety of the ship while retaining maneuverability and actually improve maneuverability. Another important development was the development of improved navigational equipment, such as the sextant and modern compass. These replaced the earlier method of navigating by northern constellations, which is highly dangerous and inaccurate. These were originally developed in Israel, but soon perfected in Germany and England, where they were then perfected and are highly accurate and are still used to this day. Because of this, the glass blowing and grinding operations in these areas also grew, as there was a demand for higher quality glass to be used in the navigational equipment.
The expansion of capitalism in Europe throughout the ages of exploration brought somewhat negative effects on common Europeans rather than positive. The expansion broadened the economic and social gap between classes, leaving not everyone to prosper. At this time, European countries were striving to establish their positions within the New World system. There were two very general steps to establishing positions: bureaucratization, homogeneization. Bureaucratization was the process of limiting increasing power in states by taxation from the monarchies. Taxing the people increased state power, so monarchies were able to borrow money more easily, and thus broadened state bureaucracy. Europeans also experienced homogeneization during the Age of Exploration. Homogeneization was the expelling of minorities in fear that minorities could be a threat to the state's economy and the expansion of capitalism. In addition to these actions, European laborers experienced major drops in wages due to cities becoming less of the center of trade as they used to be. However, not everything was so bad. Travel becomes more feasible and spreads throughout Europe from 1582 to 1701. It starts off with Portugal dominating the seas, but eventually most countries jump on. The newfound accessibility to travel overseas brings what we call the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the exchange between the Western and Eastern Hemisphere of ideas, plants, foods, and diseases. The exchange brought things like turkeys, llamas, alpacas, guinea pigs, corn, potatoes, beans, tobacco, peanuts, squash, peppers, tomatoes, pumpkins, pineapples, cocoa, chicle, papayas, guavas, avocados, and manioc. However, these travels also introduced scurvy and syphilis to Europe. Scurvy came from the lack of vitamin C from being on a ship for way too long of time. However, syphilis is a different story. The first outbreak of it comes from what they believe to be some of the crew that came back on Columbus's voyages to America. Scurvy was an unavoidable disease that was not contagious. However, syphilis was and is a sexually transmitted disease that was avoidable. This age of travel did not just bring new animals, diseases, and a flush of money for the royals and wealthy, but it also brought new ideas. Writer Michel de Montaigne wrote about his observations between European cultures and the cultures of the New World in his book, The New World. Michel highlights the ideas that the New World has brought all ideas about culture and philosophy for the Europeans. He speaks of how the discovery of other civilization brings a shock to the Europeans and, quote, began a long tradition of using non-European peoples as a basis for engaging a critique of his own culture, quote. The age of exploration forced Europeans to not only broaden their horizons on new ideas, but also to reanalyze their own. The age of exploration had both positive and negative effects on the European economy by the end of this era. The dominant economic system in the continent was no longer the same. Prior to the age of exploration, Europe was a highly agricultural society, with farming and the raising of livestock dominating trade. There were luxury goods, but few could afford them, and they usually consisted of gems, furs, and ivory from Africa. When trade with Asia through sea started in the 1400s, the introduction of spices, silk, and chinaware became more prevalent. In fact, the name China refers to porcelain from China, and the fact that this specific porcelain was in such high demand and high esteem to the Europeans. Medici porcelain in Florence was the first successful attempt at imitating Chinese porcelain. As explorations reached out to North America in the late 1400s, new luxuries such as sugar and tobacco were traded in Europe. These crops were previously unknown to most Europeans because they required a specific tropical environment in order to flourish. But it wasn't just crops that were making their way back to Europe from the New World. One of Spain's major objectives in the New World exploration was to find and take back large quantities of gold and silver. Throughout Central and South America, there were tons of precious metals to be found naturally and from the natives such as the Incas and the Aztecs. The increase in wealth as these metals were brought to Europe created a major inflationary cycle. Europe was previously cash-starved, and the sudden infusion of capital into the economy hurt the financial systems of many countries. In 1557, Spain became the first sovereign nation to declare bankruptcy and would so again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. As new goods were flowing in from both the New World and Asia, some items were so unique that Europeans had difficulty putting an accurate value on them. One infamous example is the introduction of tulips into Europe from Istanbul, Turkey. The first person to bring them back to Europe was so protective of his beautiful flowers that when he passed away, others stole them, and hype soon spread like wildfire. This new flower was so novel and exotic that all wealthy people wanted some of it. The craze over tulips got so bad that purchasers eventually stopped planting the bulbs altogether and instead just placed them out on display. Eventually, it was realized that a single tulip wasn't worth 6 barrels of wheat, 4 oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 120 gallons of wine, 1,000 gallons of beer, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. The value cached in tulips became a common good within Europe. What came back to Europe from the New World was mainly raw materials, as the slave trade was starting to pick up in the late 1500s. The process of sending raw materials to Europe, where they turned into final products and exported, was called mercantilism, and would soon come to dominate the European market system for the next few hundred years. Colonization of the New World and parts of Asia was in full swing, and this accelerated the growth of mercantilism in Europe.